Shalom, Daniel Botkin here with another Torah portion, this one called Mishpatim, which that's a Hebrew word normally translated judgments. It refers to commandments of the Torah. And this particular Torah portion goes from Exodus chapter 21 through 24. And this obviously follows Exodus chapter 20, which was the chapter in which the Ten Commandments were given. So after God gives the Ten Commandments to the children of Israel, then he gives the Mishpatim, more specific commandments, how to deal with various situations, what to do if your ox gores somebody. We go through a whole long list of things. But before I get into the details, let me just point out something you may have heard me say before, because I've taught this over the years. Yeshua said that the two most important of all the commandments are to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he said, on these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So you can look at the two greatest commandments as a two-point outline of the entire Torah. Love the Lord, love your neighbor. That's the two main parts of the Torah. And on those two commandments, you can think of the Ten Commandments as being hung upon those, because the first four commandments deal with our vertical relationship, man to God. And then the other six deal with our horizontal human relationships, man-to-man relationships. And so the Ten Commandments, no other gods before you, not making and bowing down to images, not taking the Lord's name in vain, keeping Shabbat, those all deal with our relationship with God. Although Shabbat also includes some human relationships, because it says, let your servants rest on Shabbat as well. So Shabbat kind of serves as a transition between your vertical and horizontal. But then we have Shabbat, and then honor parents. Now we're getting into human relationships. Honor your parents. Don't commit murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't covet. I'm forgetting one. Don't bear false witness. So those are our human relationships. So all of the Ten Commandments hang upon the two greatest commandments. Why do we not worship other gods? Why do we not bow down to images? Why do we not take the Lord's name in vain? Because we love the Lord. Why do we keep Shabbat? Because we love the Lord. Why do we let our servants rest if we have servants or employees? Why do we let them rest on Shabbat? Because we love our neighbor. Why do we honor parents? Why do we not kill? Why do we not commit adultery with our neighbor's wife and so forth? We do these things because we love our neighbor. So our motivation is for keeping the commandments is the fact that we love the Lord and we love our neighbor. So it all has to be motivated by love. As 1 John says, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. Yeshua said, he that has my commandments and keeps them, he it is that loves me. And I will come and manifest myself to him. So if you want to experience a manifestation of Yeshua, that's going to be determined partly by your obedience to his commandments. So all the commandments hang on the two greatest commandments. And that Hebrew word hang, talui, can also mean depends on. So our obedience to the Ten Commandments depends on our love for the Lord and our love for our neighbor. Because if you're obeying the commandments, but you're not being motivated by your love for the Lord, then your obedience may not last that long. You'll be very easily persuaded when you're tempted to go astray. If you don't have a deep, genuine, sincere love for the Lord, then you might be tempted to sin against the Lord. And if you don't have a deep, sincere love for your neighbor, you might be tempted to wrong your neighbor and do something wrong. So that's why, I don't want to sound all syrupy, sappy, sentimental, love, love, love. But love is important, that loving the Lord. But we show our love by obeying the commandments. Now, when we say that the Ten Commandments hang on the two greatest commandments, now we're getting into more specific commandments in Exodus chapter 21, and we could say that all of the following commandments, all the other commandments of the Torah, we've got the 10, now let's get the other 603 in there, and all of those commandments hang on the 10 commandments, that you can categorize all the various commandments on dealing with human relationships. Thou shalt not steal, okay? Thou shalt not steal, one of the 10 commandments. But now in Mishpatim, in this Torah portion, we're going to be told, what if somebody does steal? What do you do? If a man steals a sheep, what's the penalty going to be? If a man wrongs his neighbor by doing this, if his ox gores him, what's the penalty going to be? How are we going to handle these human relationships? Now, this particular this particular chapter is a bit of a challenge for me. Not this chapter, but this Torah portion, because most Torah portions seem to have a real theme, kind of a specific theme that pretty much runs through. And maybe this one does. But, when I look through these chapters, chapter 21, 22, 23 of Exodus, 24, there's just a lot of random stuff. And I think, okay, how do I talk for almost a half hour here? How do I tie all this stuff together? Well, I'm not going to, I guess. I'm just going to kind of go through. I'm just going to go through and point out some of the instructions here and just give some comments. Now, the first part of the Mishpatim, it's interesting that when the Lord is giving the Mishpatim, he starts out talking about treatment of slaves. Why would he start with that? Well, probably because slaves were they were in society, they were the lowest members of society. So God is showing, by starting with those that are slaves, he is showing that he cares about those who are the lowest members of society. He doesn't start out by telling the people how to treat kings, how to honor the king and so forth. No, he starts out with how to treat your servants, your slaves. Now, when we talk about slaves, people say, well, you mean the Bible condones slavery? You mean we can get the whips and chains out and all that stuff and enslave other races again? No, that's not the type of slaves. Slave is probably not the best English word used to translate this because in English, when we say slave, we think of, pre-Civil War in America, the whips and the chains and all that type of stuff. But in biblical times, what is called a slave was more in line with what was called in early colonial America indentured servants, where if a person was poor, if a person had fallen on hard times and he just didn't know how to take care of himself and his family, he could basically, in effect, sell himself into servitude to a wealthier family. And then he would be an indentured servant for a period of time, and then that way he could be helped out economically, be given a place to live and food to survive in exchange for the work that he performed. And if you study rabbinical writings, you'll learn that slaves, the rabbis had a lot of rules that they, a lot of the stuff the rabbis added was good stuff. It wasn't all bad stuff. But I think I remember reading years ago that they said that a slave owner should make sure that his slaves have living conditions that are just as good as his own, And so, we didn't have that in pre-Civil War America with the slavery here. So God shows that he cares about the lowest members of society by starting out by telling people how to treat the slaves, treat them right. And, a Hebrew slave, of course, could only serve for 6 years and on the 7th year go free. And then the Lord said, if it's time for the servant, the Hebrew servant, to leave, if he says, you know what, I love my master, I don't want to leave, I want to serve him forever. Then the Lord said, you take the servant, you was to take him to the door and bore his ear through with an awl. And so he would be marked to serve him forever. It was a permanent relationship. And I remember when I was a young Christian years ago, I heard somebody give a sermon on this, and they were comparing this act of a servant who says, you know what? I love my master so much that I don't ever want to leave him. I want to serve him for the rest of my life. And he said that that's what we do when we come to our master, Jesus. And we say, I want to serve you forever. I love my master, and I want to serve Jesus forever. And in a figurative sense, we're saying, Lord, bore my ear through with an awl. As a matter of fact, I remember way back, I think in the 70s, there was a Christian song, I think it was called doulos, which is the Greek word for servant or slave. And it was, singing about, here's my ear, pierce it through, and so forth. Anyway, as a young Christian, I saw that, okay, this commandment here, it's a picture, a prophetic picture of how we say that we want to serve our master forever. And when I was in Israel, in I think it was 77, 78, it'd been like 6 years that I'd been walking with the Lord. And I thought, yeah, I've been serving the Lord for 6 years. So now that I'm going to enter my 7th year, I want to serve him forever. so you know what? I think I'm going to get my ear pierced. And so there was a place in the town there in Israel, a jewelry store. They had a sign in English that said, "We are piercing ears." Well, they didn't mean they were doing it right that minute, but you know, their English wasn't that great, but they knew how to pierce ears. So I decided, yeah, I'm going to get my ear pierced. So just as a kind of a symbolic act, you know, to show the Lord that, you know what, I want to serve the Lord forever. I want to be his love slave for the rest of my life. So I went into the jewelry store and I had him pierce my ear, and you know, and man, I almost fainted. I don't know how the women do it. I almost passed out. I had to sit down on the ground because I was about ready to pass out after I left the store. Anyway, you know, I got a gold ring in my ear. I forget which one it was. Anyway, then I came back to America, and this was back, you know, this was in the 1970s. Guys didn't wear earrings back then, at least not very many guys. But I remember wearing that gold earring, and people say, "You got an earring in your ear?" And I said, "Yeah." And then I would explain to them what I had done. But then somebody told me, you know, in the homosexual community, it's a thing to wear one earring, and you know, if it's the left ear, it means they want the male role or female role, you know, something like that. And I thought, oh boy, I don't want people getting the wrong idea. I'm taking this thing out. So I took it out. So that was the end of my earring experience. Okay, so let's move on to this. Okay, after the earring thing, as I said, this is just a lot of random commandments, various things, what to do. So I'm just going to kind of, you know, skip around, pick and choose here. And point out some things that might be of interest to you, things that maybe you never noticed before. Exodus 21:16, "He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death." So right there, that tells you the type of slavery that was practiced in early America. Those slave traders were worthy of the death penalty, because stealing a man to sell, that warrants the death penalty. And then it also talks about treatment of servants. If the master does hurt the servant, if if his eye or tooth gets knocked out, he's to let him go, and so forth. And then a lot in this chapter 21 is about oxen. And what happens if your ox gores your neighbor and they die? What do you do? Well, the ox gets stoned, his flesh is not eaten, but the owner is acquitted. But if the ox were wont to push with his horn, if he was accustomed to pushing with his horn in time past, and they had warned the owner about that, but the owner didn't do anything, okay, then the ox is stoned and the owner also is put to death. And you might be thinking, well, what? I don't own an ox. What's this have to do with me? How many people own oxen today? How many believers out there have oxen? There are a few, obviously. But what's interesting is that the Torah commandments, like these commandments about an ox, or if a man digs a pit and he doesn't cover it and his neighbor's ox or donkey falls in and dies, what are you supposed to do? Well, the owner of the pit, he makes it good, he gives the money to the owner and so forth. Or if one man's ox gores another man's ox and it kills, you sell the live ox, divide the money, and they divide up the dead ox as well. All these different commandments about treatment of oxen, it goes from verse 28 through 36. You think, why is God talking about oxen so much? What's all this stuff to do with oxen? Well, you see, you have to understand that the commandments of the Torah are not just about oxen only. As a matter of fact, you'll remember Paul quotes another commandment about oxen. He says, to not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. And using that commandment as a principle, he says those who teach the scriptures should receive financial support for their work, because if God cares about oxen enough to say you don't put the muzzle while the ox is out there treading out the grain, give the ox a break, let him eat some of the grain that he's working there. And so Paul is saying that, does God care for oxen? Well, yeah, he does, but how much more does he care for his own people? So what we have to understand is with commandments like this, it's not just about oxen only, but it's about principles. You could say, okay, I don't have an ox, maybe you have a dog. Maybe your dog bites a neighbor. Well, what's the right thing to do? You make it good. You pay for their doctor bill or hospital bill or their time off of work or whatever. And if you'd been, or if your dog kills somebody, what's to be done? Or if your dog kills your neighbor's dog or your neighbor's cat, what do you do? So we can apply these Torah commandments not just to oxen only, but to any type of situation And it doesn't even have to be an animal or a pet or anything. If you dig a pit and you know, in their alley behind your house, public property, and your neighbor's car, he doesn't know the pit's there, and his car goes into the pit and it damages his car, what's the right thing to do? Well, you make it right, because you should have covered the pit. So, you know, we can take these Torah commandments as principles for dealing with all kinds of situations. And then in chapter 22, we get into what to do about penalizing people who steal. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he restores 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. You know, it's been pointed out before that ancient Israel had no prison system like we have. They may have had temporary holding places until the judges would determine what to be done. But in biblical times, if somebody was a thief, they didn't go to prison for it. They had to repay their victim 4 or 5 times the amount they stole. And I think, you know, that would be great if we could have something like that in our society today. Because I tell you, if somebody steals $100 off of me, and I have the choice of seeing them go to jail for a year or 2, or giving me $400, I'll take the $400. I'd rather have $400 than see that guy go to prison and have to be supported by taxpayer dollars for a year or 2. Give me the $400. And if the guy doesn't have it, put him to work. Make him sell himself as an indentured servant. Make him work it off and earn the money and pay me back my $400. I'll wait a while. So a lot of these principles are good, and our country would be a lot better off if we could function according to some of these Torah principles. And our laws in America, a lot of them are based on biblical principles. As a matter of fact, I think it's, I forget which building, I was in Washington, D.C. several years back, and in one of the buildings, I mean, there's like a sculpture up on the wall of, you know, Moses with the tablets of the law, you know, showing that our laws are derived from the commandments of God. And there are commandments about if a man causes a field or vineyard to be eaten and puts in his beast, what do you do? If fire breaks out, if a man has his neighbor watch over money for him and it gets stolen, how do you deal with that? So all kinds of principles here about how to deal with things like this that happen. One of the commandments in this Torah portion is, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. I remember years ago I had a little calendar. It had, like, you know, each day had its own little page, and it had a Bible verse for each day. And on October 31st, it had this verse, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So what does that mean? Now, some people say, well, it means witches should be burned at the stake like they did back in the Middle Ages. And other people say, well, maybe it doesn't mean to kill the witches. Maybe it just means you don't let people make a living by practicing witchcraft. You tell them you're not allowed to practice witchcraft. But, you know, let me just, you know, pause here talking about witches. I've been intrigued by the whole Salem witch trial thing. I read some research on that, about 15, 18 years ago or something. And, you know, the Salem witch trials, if you know much about it, I think it was around 18 people were executed. They'd been accused of witchcraft. And it was a really bizarre story, because it was a lot of it was children claiming that different people had practiced witchcraft. And now these were Puritans. These were, you know, God-fearing, church-going people that took the scriptures very seriously. And a lot of these children, a lot of them girls that had been dabbling in occultic things, by the way. There was a slave from Barbados that was, you know, doing some witchcraft with him and so forth. Anyway, a lot of these girls made claims that they had seen so-and-so practicing witchcraft and that their specter had appeared to them at night and so forth. And so, you know, they hung all these witches. But then after the whole thing was over, some of the leaders of Salem, they just felt horrible. They said, we were deluded. We don't know why our minds were affected this way. What was going on? And it's interesting. I was reading an article in the Smithsonian magazine way back years ago. And it said that one theory about why these people that normally were clear-thinking, God-fearing, church-going people, how could they be so deluded to think that these crazy stories about these people doing witchcraft were true? And the theory is that there's a mold called ergot, I think it is, E-R-G-O-T, and it's a mold that grows on barley, and especially if it's in damp conditions, this mold can grow on barley, and this mold, if eaten, it will affect the mind in a similar way to LSD. Some of you old hippies out there, acid trips, you know, that the ergot would affect the mind and cause people to hallucinate and imagine things. And so the theory was that it's possible that the people in Salem, Massachusetts were affected by eating this mold that made them hallucinate and imagine all this stuff. And some people did research into the weather conditions, and they said, yes, that was an especially wet winter that year, and yes, they did harvest barley. So, you know, there's no way to know for sure now, obviously, if that's true, but it was an interesting thing. So that's enough about witchcraft. Let's move on, okay? Let's see. One interesting verse. It says, "You shall be holy men unto me, neither shall you eat any flesh that is torn of beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs." So you may have heard the term trafe before. Food is trafe. Unkosher food is called trafe, which means unkosher, but literally trafe means torn. Litrof means to tear. And, you know, if you don't have a dog to cast it to, I guess you can just use your neighbor's dog. It doesn't specify what to do if you don't have a dog. But if you have some sheep and one of them gets torn by beasts in the field, don't eat that sheep. Just find a dog to cast that meat to. Okay, then we get into chapter 23 and some commandments here. Not to raise a false report, not to follow a multitude to do evil. If you meet your enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again. So here is the seed of Yeshua's commandment to love your enemies. Bless those that curse you. Do good to those that despitefully use you, and pray for them that persecute you. Here's the seed for that, is that if you meet your enemy's ox or ass going astray, you bring it back to him again. Or if you see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help him. So the Lord, even way back here in the days of Moses, is teaching love for one's enemies. And of course, verse 8 of that same chapter talks about not taking a gift or a bribe. In the context, it means a bribe, because the gift blinds the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. And you know, bribery can come in different forms, can it? It's not just money only, that people can offer bribes of other sorts. There are a lot of people that they like to manipulate. They're manipulators. They have certain things they want. Jacob was like that, obviously. You know, they know what they want. They're determined they're going to get it by hook or by crook, and so they manipulate, and they, you know, they make requests of people. I knew a young man years ago. He was kind of a freeloader. And when he'd meet somebody, he would pay them these beautiful flattery, you know, beautiful compliments, and oh, that dress is so pretty on you, and boy, you really look good today, and or you know, just give them all kinds of compliments and flattery. Well, thank you, and then after a while, he'd say, "Hey, could you loan me $20?" You know, that was just his habit. That was his way. You know, that's offering a bribe in the form of flattery, and we need to be careful that we not offer people bribes not only of money, but that we be careful not to compromise by offering to do things for people just simply because we want to get our own way, because we're manipulating the situation and so forth. Now we just have a few minutes left here, and one thing I did want to touch on in this portion is the commandment not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now, as many of you probably know, this is the verse that the rabbis use as the seed or the basis to separate milk and meat from each other. And most Messianics say, well, it doesn't say you can't eat, you know, milk with chicken. Chickens don't even give milk. But, you know, what's interesting is this commandment is given 3 times in the Torah, and 2 times the context is not in the dietary laws, But the verse says, the first of the firstfruits of thy land thou shalt bring into the house of the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk. So the context, and I think in one other place the context as well, it's in offering your firstfruits. So one Jewish commentator points out, he says, the word translated boil or cook or seethe, bashal, levashel, it normally means to cook, but that Hebrew word can also mean to mature, to ripen. So this verse may actually have nothing to do with cooking it whatsoever. It may have to do with not letting the kid grow to maturity. In other words, don't wait until he's been weaned on his mother's milk to offer him as the first fruits. If he's the first fruits, the first of the first fruits you bring to the house of the Lord, don't see the kid in its mother's milk, or don't wean the kid from its mother's milk, which takes on an entirely different meaning. But, if people want to separate milk and meat, that's okay with me. I'm not going to bash people that do that. And as a matter of fact, if I was living among Orthodox Jews, I would make a point to not mix milk and meat when I'm with Orthodox Jews. I'm not going to offer milk and meat together to an Orthodox Jew. But that's interesting that is in the context of the first fruits. And then chapter 24, just one thing very briefly to touch on, is right before they get ready to get the instructions for the tabernacle, it says Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. So 74 people, 74 men, they go up, and then listen to what it says. And it says the same thing in Hebrew. You can check the Hebrew. This is an accurate translation. It says, then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. They saw the God of Israel. People say, nobody can see God. Yeshua even said, no man hath seen God. Well, no man has seen God in his full glory, but in a veiled form, God can be seen. And it says, they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. So I don't know exactly what this manifestation of God that they saw looked like, other than what it says here. But it says, they saw, it says it again in verse 3, upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also, they saw God and did eat and drink. So, I think sometimes we can just kind of read over some of these things, and the full impact doesn't really sink in, to consider that they actually saw the God of Israel in some form, in some fashion. They saw God, and they ate and drank in the presence of God. And even though no man has seen the Father in all of his glory, in Yeshua, Jesus, he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And no, we don't see him with these eyes of flesh, but with the eyes of the heart, the eyes of the Spirit, we look unto Yeshua, the author and finisher of our faith. Thank you for watching. Shalom.